Welcome back, everyone. Today we're making a tote bag, and the finished tote bag measures in at 15.5 by 13.5 by 7 inches. But you can easily change the dimensions of this pattern to best suit your needs. This project is on the easier side, so if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem following the easy step-by-step tutorial. With all that being said, don't forget to grab the printable PDF pattern, and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you'll need 1 yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a canvas, denim, or twill. These are all very durable fabrics and they're easy to work with. So it all kind of depends on what you're using the bag for. I'm actually going to be making mine out of a few different fabrics. I'm going to be using a Sherpa material and also an upholstery fabric. But like always, get creative with it and use the fabric that's really going to make your design pop. You'll need 1 yard for your secondary fabric, and this is going to be the lining on the inside. So I recommend using something lightweight, and again, it also depends on what you're making this tote bag for, but I'm going to be using a super lightweight cotton. I just liked how it looked with the bag and it made for a nice lining. You'll need 1 9-inch zipper. I'll be cutting my zipper from a zipper roll. I found this was a great way to go. You can cut your zippers precisely and minimize the waste. This is going to be for the pocket on the inside of the bag. If you're not making the pocket, you don't need the zipper. You'll need 2 to 4 yards of 1 to 1.5 inch webbing, and the reason for this is that it gives you an option to extend the handle. You can make the handle super short, or you can extend it and make it really long. So having at least 4 yards of webbing, you'll land within those parameters. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is download it, print it off, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you start taping your pattern together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is going to allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. Once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting. And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. Be sure to check your printer alignment for the best possible results. And from here, we're going to cut on the outside of the black line. After cutting, you should end up with 2 lining pocket front top panels cut out of your secondary fabric, 2 lining front bottom panels cut out of your secondary fabric, 1 lining pocket back panel cut out of your secondary fabric, 2 lining side bottom panels cut out of your secondary fabric, 2 lining side top panels cut out of your main fabric, 2 lining main bottom panels cut out of your secondary fabric, 2 lining main top panels cut out of your main fabric, 1 lining bottom panel cut on the fold out of your secondary fabric, 2 side pocket panels, 1 out of your secondary fabric and 1 out of your main fabric, 2 side panels cut on the fold out of your main fabric, 2 side bottom cover panels cut out of your main fabric, or you can use a leather or vinyl, 1 bottom cover panel cut out of your main fabric, and the same goes for this panel. You can use leather or vinyl. And lastly, 1 main panel cut on the fold out of your main fabric. Moving on to construction, we're going to start by grabbing the lining pocket front top panels. Along with the panels, grab your 9-inch zipper, locate the zipper edge on the pattern, and we'll be attaching the zipper to the zipper edge of the panel. Sandwich the zipper in between both of the panels with right sides together, line up the outside edge, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fold the wrong sides of the panels together and place a few pins. Grab the lining pocket front bottom panels, locate the zipper edge, and we're going to do the same thing. Sandwich the zipper in between both of the panels, lining up the outside edges for both the top and bottom panels, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fold the wrong sides together, lining up the outside edges, place a few pins. From here, we're going to add a top stitch to both sides of the zipper. I recommend using an edge presser foot for the best possible results. As you can see, I don't have a zipper train. This is because I cut my zipper from a roll, and I like doing it this way because it makes it easier to install the zipper without having to navigate around the zipper train. But before we go any further, we do have to install the zipper train, so just slide it on and move it towards the center of the panel. Locate the lining pocket back panel. Place the right sides together, lining up the top and bottom edge. Add a few pins to keep the layers secured down. Stitch the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving the top edge unstitched. Take your time when you're sewing over the zipper track. After finishing up the stitch, we're going to snip the zipper ends flush with the seam allowance. Before we flip the right sides out, I want to quickly show you how you can clean up that raw edge on the inside. It's a really simple technique. All you have to do is serge around the outside edge. If you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch. But ultimately, it cleans up that raw edge and prevents future fraying. Pull the right sides out, pop out the bottom corners, and we're going to do the same thing to the top edge. Using a serger, we're going to seal the edge closed, or you can use a zigzag stitch. That's going to complete the inside pocket. If you want, you can add a top stitch around the outside edge. And also keep in mind, you can make this pocket as big as you want. As long as it fits in the bag, you're good to go. But anyways, we can place the complete pocket panel off to the side, grab our lining side bottom panel and our lining side top panel. Locate the connect to edge on both the top and bottom panel. And this is where we're going to connect them. Separate all the panels, place the right sides together. You should have 2 sets, and we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After finishing up the stitch, open up the panel so the right side is facing up. We're going to be adding a top stitch, so locate the seam allowance, make sure it is pointing up, and stitch directly on top of the seam allowance, adding your top stitch. After finishing up the stitch, double check, make sure all the layers are looking good, the top stitch is looking good, and we can place these panels off to the side. And grab the lining main top and lining main bottom panels. And we're going to be doing the same thing as the previous step. Locate the connect to edge on both of the panels. But before we sew the top and bottom together, we want to grab the complete pocket assembly. With the right side facing up, we're going to place it on the top edge of the main bottom panel. It doesn't matter which one you place it on, just make sure you place it in the center on the top edge. And from here, we're going to place the right sides together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the right sides up and we're going to add a top stitch. Just like in the previous steps, we're going to roll that seam allowance towards the top and stitch directly on top of the main fabric. And I'm using an edge presser foot. It helps get nice consistency throughout the bag. And the fun thing about this, you can add more than one inside pocket. You can add these to both of the panels. You can make this pocket bigger. So have some fun with it and make it custom to your needs. Slide these panels to the side and grab the lining bottom panel. Unfold the panel with right sides facing up. Separate the main assemblies, locate the longer edge on the bottom lining panel. We'll be lining the edge up with the bottom of the main assembly. With one of the main assemblies off to the side and stitch the bottom edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Open up the panel so the right side is facing up, grab the second main assembly and stitch it on the opposite side of the lining bottom panel. We're not going to be adding a stitch all the way through, we're going to leave a gap in the middle. This is so we can pull the right sides out at the end when we stitch all the components together. And I recommend leaving at least a 4-inch gap for this size bag so that way you can pull everything out easily without having to dethread. But if the opening turned out a little bit small, that's totally fine. I recommend waiting till the end to make any adjustments. Grab both the lining side panel assemblies. Locate the bottom edge, and this is the edge that's opposite of the main fabric, and we'll be sewing them to the sides of the lining bottom panel. Place the right sides together, lining up the bottom edge with the side edge of the lining, and we can do both of the panels in one session. Add a few pins to keep everything lined up, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This technique is a little bit different, but it's going to make for perfectly square corners in the end. From here, we're going to sew up the sides, so line up the side of the side panel with the side of the main panel. And it's really important to line up both of the top lining panels. With everything lined up, we're going to stitch the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And remember, we're stitching through that bottom corner. After finishing up the stitch, you can move to the inside, check to make sure all the layers got stitched together, and as you can see, that corner pops out perfectly. With one side complete, we can do the same thing for the opposite side. Place the right sides together, lining up the top lining edge, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way through that bottom corner. And again, this technique gives you a perfectly square bottom that works great for tote bags. And real quick before we move on, I recommend looking on the inside of the bag, make sure everything is looking good, all the layers are stitched together. And if everything's looking good, that's going to complete the lining for the bag, and this is going to become our lining assembly, and we can place it off to the side. And grab our side pocket panels and our side bottom cover panels. We're going to be adding the side bottom cover panel onto the pocket panel. Using the pattern, you can locate the placement guide on the pocket panel. We're only going to be attaching one of these to the pocket panel so you can place one off to the side. And it will only be going on the main fabric so you can place a secondary fabric off to the side as well. And we're trying to get it to line up with the bottom edge, so we're going to pull it past the bottom edge a 1/4 inch, flip the right sides together, and add our stitch. Flip the cover panel back down so the right side is facing up, check the bottom edge, make sure it lines up perfectly. If everything is looking good, from here we can add our top stitch. After finishing up the top stitch, double check one more time and make sure that bottom edge lines up. Slide the panel to the side and grab the secondary fabric. Locate the top edge, and this is going to be the side that's opposite of the cover panel. Place the right sides together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fold the wrong sides together, lining up the top and the bottom edge. Place a few pins and add a top stitch along that top edge. Feel free to add 1 or 2 stitches. And that's going to complete our side pocket panel. This will now become our side pocket assembly, and we can place it off to the side and grab our side panel. Unfold the panel so the right side is facing up. To start, we only need one, so place the other one off to the side. We're going to be adding the second bottom cover panel to our new side panel, so grab the last side bottom cover panel. And essentially, we're going to sew it on the same way. Pull it past the bottom edge 1/4 inch, flip the right sides together and stitch at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the cover panel back down so the right side is facing up. Check to see if the bottom edge lines up and add a top stitch. Before we move on, it's best to grab the pocket panel and line it up with the side panel. Make sure these two edges are the same exact height. If everything checks out, we can place the side panel off to the side, keep the pocket panel out, and grab the opposite side panel. Place the pocket panel on top of the side panel, lining up the side and bottom edges. From here, we're going to stitch just the sides as close as we can to that outside edge. We're just bringing these layers together to make it easier in future steps once we start assembling the bag. With our new side pocket panel assembly complete, we can place it off to the side and grab our main panel. Unfold the main panel with right sides facing up. Using the pattern, we're going to locate the webbing placement guides. To get an accurate placement for the webbing straps, I like to chalk it out in the middle and on both of the sides. Reflect the panel over the center line and chalk out the opposite side. I'm using a 1.5 inch width webbing for this project. You can pretty much use any size webbing you want, or you can make your own straps. Just make sure you place it in the center of those guides. But what you're trying to do is wrap that webbing around through all the placement guides in a loop. Before you stitch it down, it's best to figure out how high you want these handles to be. I kind of left it open-ended because everyone has a different preference on how long they want the handles to be. And it's very easy to get it exactly how you want it by either adding or subtracting webbing. Once you've figured out the size of the handles, you want to trim your webbing and have the ends meet directly in the center. This is because we're going to be placing a cover panel in the center and it's going to hide that overlap. The next step is figuring out how high you want to stitch up on those straps. I like to try to stitch as close to that top edge as possible. I wouldn't go any further than 4 inches because then at that point it starts getting floppy at the top. The closer you can get, the more structure it will have, but keep in mind you want to leave at least 1/2 inch so that way we can sew the lining onto the main panel. And all we have to do from here is sew the straps down. This step can take a little bit of time. I recommend using an edge presser foot so you can get right up on the edge with an even stitch. I also recommend matching the thread color to the webbing color to hide any imperfections. And to really secure that strap down, I recommend going back and adding a few bar tacks at the top of the strap. If you prefer to do an X stitch or a box stitch, that's totally fine too. This area takes the most strain, so it's best just to add a few extra stitches so you have a long-lasting tote bag. But anyways, unfold the panel with right sides facing up. Using the pattern, we're going to locate the bottom cover panel placement guide. I like to lay out the pattern on top of the panel and chalk it out on both sides. Reflect the pattern over the center and chalk the opposite side. Grab the bottom cover panel. Unfold the bottom cover panel with right sides facing up. Using the guides, we're going to line the cover panel up in the center of the main panel. With the cover panel lined up, we're going to roll the edges over 1/4 inch. And it's just the edges on the inside of the main panel. Place a few pins to keep it from moving around and stitch both sides of the cover panel. And technically this is kind of like a top stitch, so feel free to use an edge presser foot. Open up the panels with right sides facing up. Grab both of your side panels. Separate them with right sides facing up. We're going to be sewing the side panels to the sides of the main panel, lining up the top edge and the cover panels. So starting with one side, place the right sides together, lining up the top edge and the bottom cover panel. Similar to how we did the lining, we're going to stitch that edge at 1/4 inch seam allowance just up to the bottom edge. In the end, this is going to give us a nice square corner. And after finishing up the stitch, open up the panels and check to see if all the cover panels line up. If it's looking good, we can flip the opposite side of the main panel up, lining up the top edge. And from here, we're going to grab the side panel and line it up just how we did in the previous step on the opposite side of the main panel. Place a few pins to keep everything from moving around. Stitch both sides at 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, we're stitching just to that bottom edge and stopping. After finishing up the stitch, double check to make sure all the layers got stitched together, and it's a good idea to actually open it up and look at the inside or the right side of the bag, because it's easier to de-thread and make corrections at this point rather than doing it in the future. Next, we're going to move to the bottom edge of the side panel and we're going to press all those layers together and stitch at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Repeat the stitch for both sides of the bag. And since there's multiple layers, it's best to check that bottom edge to make sure everything got stitched together. And thus we're gonna flip the right sides out and check all the seams once more. And as you can see, this technique really pops those corners and makes them super square. Moving on, we're gonna flip the wrong sides back out, slide your panel to the side and grab your complete lining assembly. Pull the right side of your lining out, and what we're gonna be doing is placing the lining on the inside of our main panel with the right sides together. And when it comes to the straps, you wanna push them towards the inside of the bag so that way they're in between the lining and the main layer. It's pretty easy to line everything up because you can use the corners as reference. If all the corners are lined up, place a few pins and stitch all the way around that top edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take your time, go slow, make sure everything stays aligned as you're sewing. Once you finish up the stitch, double check, make sure the layers are looking good. If everything's looking good, we're gonna move towards the inside lining, find that opening in the lining that we left earlier, and pull the entire bag out through the opening so the right sides are facing out. We are going to finish up the top edge, but before we get to the top edge, we want to move back towards the inside of the lining, find the opening in the seam, and we're just going to seal that off. I like to roll the edges over towards the inside of the hole so the right sides are together and add a top stitch. Feel free to add a couple stitches to really seal off that opening. Stuff the lining back into the main portion of the bag. Play around with the top edge so that way the outside and inside are perfectly lined up. Place a few pins and add a top stitch all the way around that top edge. And depending on what type of fabric you're using, you can do 1 to 2 stitches. I actually did 2 stitches because this fabric is a little bit thicker and I really want that top edge to be nice and neat. Another fun thing to do is use a decorative stitch to get a nice accent at the top. And the final step is adding your branding. I just use a basic leather strip installed with double-sided rivets. Don't forget to add a zipper pull to the inside pocket if you chose to make the pocket. And the final thing I want to go over is adjusting the size of this bag. You can pretty much make this any size you want so it works with what you want to use it for. The actual printout size of this pattern should not really matter because you can scale it up higher, longer, wider, very easily by adjusting the sides and the main panel. Just keep in mind, every time you go up on one panel, you need to also make the same adjustments to the side panel and the main panel. Same goes for the width. If you make the side panel wider, then you also want to make the main panel a little bit longer to match the width. You can also add more pockets on the inside lining and also add another pocket on the side panel. The possibilities are really endless. It's best just to sit down and think about what you need this bag for and then build it around that. And there you go, your tote bag is complete. Hopefully you found these steps to be helpful and maybe picked up a couple sewing techniques that you can use on other projects. I'd love to see what you come up with, so tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing. But until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.